All
This
right.
conference will now be recorded.
Let me thank all of you for joining our Bible study today, our noonday Bible study for Second Baptist Church of Ypsilanti. This is our First Thessalonians Bible study, and today we are in First Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. I want to thank Reverend Jones for covering last week and all of you all that participated. Again, for next week, because we will be in. No, I'm mistaken. We'll update you on schedule if there's an update for next week. But this week we'll be in First Thessalonians chapter 2 verses. I'm tripping. Today's the 26th, right? All day long. Okay. First Thessalonians chapter 2 verses 1 through 12. And so that's where we'll be today. And then next week we'll finish this part of this chapter and get into the next. So let's get into our text for this chapter, and I'm reading from the Christian Standard Bible. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 1, for you yourselves know, brothers and sisters, that our visit with you was not without result. On the contrary, after we had previously suffered and were treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know, we were emboldened by our God to speak the gospel of God to you in spite of great opposition. For our exhortation didn't come from error or impurity, or an intent to deceive. Instead, just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak not to please people, but rather God who examines our hearts. For we never used flattering speech, as you know, or had greedy motives. God is our witness, and we did not seek glory from people, either from you or for others. Although we could have been a burden as Christ's apostles, instead we were gentle among you as a nurse nurtures her own children. We cared so much for you that we were pleased to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become dear to us. But you remember our labor and hardship, brothers and sisters, working night and day, so that we would not burden any of you. We preach God's gospel to you. You are witnesses, and so is God, of how devoutly, righteously, and blamelessly we conducted ourselves with you believers. As you know, like a father with his own children, we encouraged, comforted, and implored each one of you to walk worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. Amen. May the Lord bless his word. I promise, I want to encourage you all to read God's word out loud sometimes. It will come more alive sometimes when we hear it and see it. So I want to encourage you when you're reading and studying and taking notes, occasionally to do that. I want to give us a thought today, and this comes from H.B. Charles. Preacher, you are a herald of the gospel, not the manager of a brand. Who cares if they are not impressed with you? Just want us to think about that for a minute, meditate on that, because one of the hazardous things of ministry is that we can get caught up in what other people think of us. And I saw this quote a couple of weeks ago, and I said, "Oh Lord, that fits First Thessalonians 2." Um, um, it can wreck our ministries, whatever ministry, and you don't have to necessarily be a preacher, but whatever ministry you serve in, if you are too worried about the opinion of others, whether or not they are impressed with you, whether or not they care for you, whether or not people like you, or you have an impressive presence among them, is irrelevant. Share the gospel of Jesus Christ. Do the ministry God has called you to. Because as we see in this lesson and the previous lesson, in spite of what people may say or believe, the gospel is going to offend someone and they're not going to like it. And as a result of you sharing the gospel with them, living the gospel in front of them, they may not like you. And as Paul, Silas, and Timothy discover, you may be mistreated because of your faith in God. As a matter of fact, in our lesson, we discovered in Acts 16 and 17 that they were outrageously, as Paul puts it in the text, mistreated in Philippi and then later in Thessalonica. And so they were mistreated. And I'm going to go through the lesson, then we'll come back and grab our discussion question. So this is not.
Pastor,
Yes, go ahead, sister. Yes, you
The
can.
quote there, you said not the manager of a brand.
Of a brand.
What? I
Like
mean,
like there's Nike, there's Gucci,
oh,
there's
okay, I got you.
yeah. But some people think that their ministry is their brand. So SBCYPSI is what we commonly use to refer to Second Baptist Church and all of our online ministries. But we're not managing a brand. We're not
Got,
trying to impress people.
got you.
We're trying to, yeah. So trying to do that though, if we treat the gospel and the ministry of the church like it's a brand name that we have to protect, or if we treat our self-image like it's a brand that we have to protect, the gospel can go wanting. We can lose people because we're trying to save ourselves, and or we're trying to impress people. So this lesson really gets into authentic ministry, and I'm not preaching today, but if I was going to preach a message on this passage, I think that's probably what I would refer to would be authentic ministry, because the gospel doesn't need props. Uh, it needs to be proclaimed. Okay. And Dr. H.B. Charles, Pastor H.B. Charles, said this a few weeks ago, and I just grabbed onto it because it's helpful. All right. So they were mistreated, but not discouraged. And you remember how in Philippi, and let me say one thing that was particularly egregious about and outrageous about how Paul and Silas and Timothy were treated. Remember that Paul was a Roman citizen. And in Acts chapter 16, if we jump back there, you will remember that Paul was in Philippi. They went there. They met Lydia, a God-fearing woman. She had her own business, which was, by the way, a business that was a very wealthy, a wealth-producing business. The purple that she dealt in, was dye that was used on cloth that was typically imported from Egypt. The cloth, the dye itself came from the murex shellfish, and thousands of them had to be killed to extract this dye, which meant that Lydia was a wealthy, powerful woman. And she heard what Paul was saying in the gospel, opened her heart. Her and her household were baptized, and they stayed there a while. Paul cast a demon out of a slave girl, and her owners, because she made them money as they exploited her condition, um, um, took them before the city officials. They were beaten, they were attacked, and severely, they were beaten and flogged. Um, this was a particularly horrible crime because Roman citizens could not be flogged, and Paul was a Roman citizen. And if you had the marks of flogging on your body anywhere, you could not become a free Roman citizen. And so the marks that Paul, scars that he had as a result of this flogging and this beating, he and Silas, if they were not already Roman citizens, they could have never moved beyond the level of being a slave in Roman society. And so that's one of the reasons why Paul calls this such a egregious thing. And Paul and Silas are in the Philippian jail, singing and praying. God sends an earthquake and releases them from prison, and the jailer's about to kill himself. The jailer does not kill himself because Paul tells him not to. We're all here. And he realizes that he needs to be saved. And they share Jesus with him, and he and his household come to faith in Jesus Christ, and he takes them home and washes their wounds. They are in the midst of their bleeding scars, baptizing the household of the jailer. And his whole entire household comes to faith in Jesus. And at daylight, they tell them, go ahead and release them. But Paul said, they beat us without a public trial, although we are citizens. Let them come and escort us out. They were terrified when they heard that Paul and Silas were Roman citizens, because they had committed a crime against the state by beating them without a trial. And so they escort them, appease them, and then they leave Lydia's house. But they continue to encourage the brothers and sisters in the faith, and then they head toward Thessalonica. And that's why we say that they were mistreated but not discouraged. Brothers and sisters, sometimes when we are mistreated in the midst of our ministry, the first thing we want to do is pack up our suitcase and go home. When we are mistreated in the midst of our ministry, sometimes the first thing we want to do is leave and go sit down somewhere. But what Paul says is that you know that our ministry among you was not without result. Even though they were mistreated, God emboldened them to carry on. Okay. And as a result, their preaching pleased God. Okay. And so in verse 3, for our exhortation did not come from error or impurity or intent to deceive. Instead, just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak not to please people, but rather God who examines our hearts. And so Paul's claim was that his message was true and his motives were pure. His methods were straightforward. They were faithful, and they weren't preaching for the approval of others, because it is God who examines our ministry and our hearts. God knows us inside and out, and he knows our motives for what we do. And it's interesting to me, and you all can chime in on this if you want to, that Paul claims that they were approved by God, yet they suffered mistreatment. So there is no exemption for the servant of God for suffering, because it may occur in the midst of our ministry. Okay, so they're preaching, please God. They didn't use flattery. They didn't use. They weren't greedy, and they weren't seeking glory. There's an old saying that the flatterer doth rob by stealth his victim, both of wit and wealth. The flatterer doth rob by stealth his victim, both of wit and wealth. Be careful of people who butter you up, try to get next to you. For they have some ulterior motive. Some of us recognize that in romance, but we don't always recognize that in spiritual matters. But in Paul's day, flattery was much despised because it was easy to see through. Somebody that tried to, as we used to say back in the day, butter you up, or fatten us up for the kill. I used to work with a lady who used to say, I'm not fattening frogs for snakes. Paul was not trying to get rich from his preaching or his ministry, but it was common in Paul's day for itinerant philosophers and orators to come along, and they would speak and demand payment, or you would pay them first and then they would proclaim whatever they had to say. But Paul came, and this is the key in ministry, to give, not to get. He came to give, not to get. Ministry is about sacrifice. It's about suffering. It's about giving to others, not getting from others. Yes, it is true that the one that works in ministry is worthy of the hire. That is true, but that's not our motive. And so Paul did not demand that the Thessalonians treat him as some elevated apostle, as people often do today. But he and Silas and Timothy were gentle, like a nursing mother would be to her children. I was talking to my sister yesterday, and I could hear her holding the grandbaby in her arms. And I could hear the grandbaby's coos and ahs and sneezes, and I could hear the tenderness in my sister's voice as she was talking to the baby. That's the picture of Paul's ministry, was gentleness, not harshness, and caring to the extent that they shared their own lives. Paul worked and was bivocational, tent making, so that they could share the gospel without burdening the church at Thessalonica. You remember the churches in this area, Macedonia, were not wealthy like the church at Corinth, but Paul used his trade to allow him to share the gospel. One of the things that's interesting in this passage, I don't know if you all saw this, but in verse number 8, they not only shared the gospel, but also their own lives. Go ahead, Sister Argo. Okay, I'm sorry. I thought you were saying something. I wanted to have
but at that moment, the dog decided that he's watching for the mailman, and he decided he wanted to say something. So I unmuted.
Okay. All right.
What I was going to say, that, you talked about flattery being much despised back in Paul's days, but, flattery is still so, in our society today, many people try to flatter you. As you said, you watch when people are flattering you, because usually there's a purpose that they have in mind behind it. Oh, you're so you make the best cakes, so maybe they want you to bake a cake, but that's the way they come at you, by the use of flattery. And it's still, even though it was despised in Paul's day, today it's well practiced in society.
Absolutely. And what we must recognize is that is the tactic that the devil used in the Garden of Eden. He starts off with that. And so we have to be aware of it. But our ministry should not be marked by trying to gain a tactical advantage over people, but by caring for them. And you make that good point, that we care for people. I wanted to have a little discussion around this. There's something unusual in this text, and that is that they shared their lives. And there is a notion today of what we call, and I've even heard this phrase used in medicine and in ministry, professional distance. What is meant by that, and what's unusual about that in this lesson?
You don't want to get too close to the people. You want to put up a barrier, and I think in some cases it's very defensive, because if you're a doctor, you're seeing people who they're here today, they might die the next week. And if you get involved with them, that just makes you hurt. In the case of ministers and so forth, in a way, it's the same thing. You don't want to get too emotionally involved. But I was thinking, when I saw that one of the things that can break down barriers is to share your story, to share your life. If you're way up here and you're talking to someone way down there, and they look at you differently until you start sharing your life, because that lets them know that you care, and most of all, lets them know that it doesn't make any difference where you come in life. You still have some of the same problems that everyone else has.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Anyone
And
else
I
care to go ahead?
and I think that along with Sister Murphy's comment that in sharing, we also lift up and support and encourage one another, because sometimes we have a tendency to think that the things that we're experiencing all by ourselves, and that no one else has experienced them, or we forget that we're not on this island all by ourselves. So I think it's important to share.
Absolutely.
Pastor,
Absolutely. Go ahead.
I
And
think
some,
that
oh,
in
I,
profession, can
Go
you
ahead,
hear
Dr.
me?
Dean Smith.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
I think that in professional distance, you have to reverence the office that a person holds. I've had that in my family because all of my pastors have been my cousins or my uncle. So I've had to keep that professional distance even with them. You know, I call them Reverend this and Reverend that. So it's just that you acknowledge the office that that person holds, and even as an administrator in education, you have to realize that there are some things that you can talk about, some things that you have to be careful how you speak with, because you have to know that people are different and they have different needs and they have different wants. You have to be
Yeah.
careful that you try to speak to those.
All right. Yeah, I think that there's two sides to this, and you all hit on it perfectly. One is we ought to be willing to share our lives and our testimony and the fact that we hurt and we heal just like others do. But on the flip side, we have to be careful that we're not too common, and we who may be in the office disrespect the office by what we do. But it is important to share our lives, our experiences, our testimony, so that, as you all said, people don't think they're going through this by themselves, or that we don't appear to be some super saint that's different from everybody else. That, but let me throw this around one more bend, and that is that we ought to live authentic lives so that people get up close to us, are able to get up close to us, but they're not frightened or turned off by our faults. And so that's that authenticity, that Christian authenticity ought to shine through all the time. And that's where Paul comes in with this pastoral care and concern, but also as an encouraging example. Um, um, Paul called on his readers to bear witness to his how they conducted themselves. And there are some people that think that you can live one life in public and another life in private. But the truth is that people see us when we don't think we're being seen. And so Paul says, "You are witnesses, and also so is God, of how devoutly, righteously, and blamelessly we conducted ourselves with you believers. As you know, like a father with his own children, we encourage, comforted, and implored each one of you to walk worthy of God, who calls you into his kingdom and glory." And so Paul's uh, behavior was like that of a good father. He was devout toward God, he was upright toward others, and his toward himself he was blameless. He was preparing, which is one of the roles of a father, preparing uh, his children for maturity. And I could camp out all day on that, because sometimes the reason they fail to launch is because we don't get that boot on real good and help them.
that's it.
But go ahead.
Factor in that there are some professions that you have to keep that distance. There are codes of ethics sometimes that prevent you from being able to move beyond a certain point with the clients, I'll say. And then
Sure.
also, I grew up with a long time ago, but I grew up at a time that we were taught that the, your pastor, you didn't become you loved your pastor, you were friendly with them, but you didn't go beyond a certain point because the pastors were held in the highest respect, and that you didn't go beyond a certain point with your pastor. You always kept in mind that he was your pastor, and
Yeah, I agree with that. And I agree with there's a certain ethical issue there, and that is that we have to be careful not to create emotional dependency on ourselves, but keep pointing people toward Christ. That can be dangerous as well, that people become dependent on us or emotionally involved with us to the extent that Christ is obscured and we take center stage. But as you said, sister, there is a certain respect that comes with the office. And I would argue that that is one of the reasons why we have to carry ourselves the way we do, so that respect is maintained. But it ought to be tender, and it ought to be fatherly. And some of us haven't had great examples in that arena. But the goal of a father is to care and protect, provide, and encourage and help stimulate children toward maturity. And that's how ministry and ministers ought to conduct ourselves, is we recognize that respect is there, but we're cultivating a nurturing environment where people can grow, develop, and mature. So I think there's a lot in all of that. And the goal is to keep the kingdom in front of people, so that we recognize that the future glory that God calls us to ought to stimulate our present activity. The future reward and rest that we will enter ought to focus our minds and our ministries as well. Other questions or comments about that? All right, let me share this with us. I had the privilege of preaching the funeral for a family member last week. And this person was a veteran. They were powerful in their personal life and presentation, but humble at the same time. And they had a great impact. And every person that I talked to, whether they were at the funeral or not, talked about the impact that this person had on their life for good and how encouraging they were. And that just reminded me that that's how it ought to be for us. Let's talk about these 20 characteristics of Paul's ministry real quick. This is a blueprint for those of us that serve in any kind of ministry. And I would encourage you to go back, highlight these. You might want to break these out and look at how they impact us. What are some of the characteristics of our ministries that we might need to work on? Paul was bold in spite of opposition. He didn't shrink from persecution. He was accurate with his message. He was pure in his motives. He didn't have some ulterior motive for his ministry. He was honest in his methods. He was not a man pleaser. He was not trying to impress people, but he was motivated by pleasing God. He was truthful. He was not greedy. He was not in it for the money. Mercenaries operate on the principle of money. Ministry operates on the principle of sacrifice. He was not egotistical. He was not authoritarian. He had authority, but he was not lording it over other people. He was gentle. He was unselfish, affectionate. He was transparent. His life was an open book. He was a hard worker, and he was devoted to God. He was upright toward others, and that's one of the principles that we ought to embrace, and blameless in his own eyes. We know ourselves better than anyone else does. And when we look in the mirror, we ought to be able to see clearly. that we are living an authentic life. And he was earnest in his instruction, purposeful in his objective. He had laid out for us the blueprint of what ministry looks like. Was Paul perfect? No. None of us are except Christ. But that ought to be our objective, is to have an authentic, effective, nurturing, caring, and effective ministry that touches the lives of others. Okay. All right, let's get into our discussion questions. Go ahead.
Can I do one thing? Isn't it
Sure.
though a difference there in terms of like Paul's life was devoted to God, and that was his main focus in life was devoting and spreading the gospel and spreading the message. He didn't have another focus, another pull there on his life. That's what it was about. And many of us, and most of the time, we are torn with, like I said, in society, you have, I'll say, jobs and whatnot that takes up a part, and families. And so it's not as straight cut, I'll say, for as many of us. For the
Yeah.
folks. Go ahead, because I wanted to.
No. But I this is the way I have seen it. This is the
Okay.
way I have seen it. And I have served as I do now as a pastor that only serves the church. It doesn't have a quote outside job. I don't think there's such a thing as a part-time pastor though. But I have been bivocational. I did that for 11 years. And I served as an associate minister for 19 years while working, going to school and earning degrees and whatnot. I have always seen that our secular occupation is an extension of our ministry. Our secular occupation is an extension of our ministry. Paul was a tent maker. So were Aquila and Priscilla. So Paul meets Aquila and Priscilla while making tents. They wind up working with him in ministry because they're of the same trade. So I want to argue that those of us who are employed, and I hear some there's some oohs in the background. Those of us that have a job that may not be directly ministry related, our occupation is an extension of our vocation. Our occupation is an extension of our calling in Christ. And I've discovered that often people's ministry gifts and their talents and their occupation, I'm getting ready to teach this spiritual gifts class in a few weeks, are tied together. We have a member that works in the auto plant, but God uses their job at the auto plant to help spread the gospel. We have a member who's a doctor, but God uses their skills in the hospital to help extend healing to others. And so wherever we are, wherever God has placed us, if we're in the grocery store, in the auto plant, in the medical field, in the teaching in the classroom, or wherever we work, our vocation, which is our ministry calling and equipping, how God has equipped us to serve in ministry, and that's all of us. Our job, our occupation is an extension of our vocation. And I hope that we will see it that way, because it will knock down this false idea that I'm one person in ministry, I'm another person when I'm on my job. There ought to be a consistency there. Does that help?
Yes.
Amen. Yeah.
Number 18, I thought was very notable. Blameless in his own eyes. To me, that shows that he had the ability to examine himself. And not only he had the ability to examine himself, but he had a measuring rod or something by which to examine himself. So I think that's very important in ministry or just in life.
And Dean Smith, what is the measuring rod by which we examine ourselves?
That which Jesus said.
Yes, absolutely. So I can evaluate my own life based upon what Christ has said in his word. But one of the necessary skills for those of us that work in ministry is the ability to see how other people view us. Not
It's
to be
very
overly
good.
concerned with it,
Very
but to
good.
see how we show up in other people's lives and edit our presentation for the glory of God. Uh,
Amen.
uh,
Amen. That's great.
yeah, there's a thing called metacognition. Metacognition is the ability to think about what I'm thinking about. But there also is this ability to see how we show up in the lives of others and then to edit our presentation so that God is glorified and the gospel is clear. And so sometimes we need to think about how we show up and edit ourselves so that we're pointing people to Christ and not us. And that's a skill that I learned in leadership development. That God brings our awareness, a self-awareness to us of how we show up so that we can be helpful to others. Okay. This is a powerful lesson. I thank God for you all participating. Let's get into these discussion questions because I'm interested to see what you all discovered in your groups. And by the way, if you're not in a group, please let us know so we can help you get plugged in. And in the chat, yes. And sister, we were getting a word that funeral may have been changed to the 4th. And so we'll get the announcement out about that. Thank you so much. Acts 16:40, how had Paul and Silas been treated in Philippi? What was he and his companions' response to this treatment? How did they respond?
They actually prayed, they sang hymns, and they went to Lydia's house and they continued to encourage the brothers and sisters.
Yes. They prayed and sang hymns. They were not cussing and fussing and writing letters. They prayed and sang hymns. And then once they got out, they went and encouraged others. Thank you. That's amazing because I can't think of too many people who, after suffering a beating, that would be their response. But what an example for us. Oh, my goodness. Why did Paul rehearse the events of his ministry among his readers? Why did he do that?
To strengthen their confidence in him.
Yes, to strengthen their confidence in him. Why? Am I breaking up? Or go ahead, Sister Burks.
He wanted to summarize his motives and actions to them, and he wanted to, I guess, address questions and the accusations from those critics who were persecuting him.
Yes, absolutely. Let me take this a step further. Why is that necessary?
Well, I think it's because the foundation of any progress or success for whether it's a ministry or a pastorship, that there is confidence and respect for leadership.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. That's spot on. What people will often do is attack the person in order to invalidate the message. And so Paul, as you all have so eloquently stated, defends the events of his ministry to authenticate it for his hearers. Because remember, they didn't have video to roll back and they didn't always have a written record. And so Paul has to review the record of his service so that they understand the relationship that he had with Christ and the church. All right. What was Paul's reason for speaking to the church at Thessalonica?
It was to encourage them not to abandon the gospel message and
Yes,
their belief in it.
yes. To encourage them not to abandon the gospel message and their belief in it. And that holds true today. That's why all of us are joined together today. The enemy always wants us to throw in the towel on the gospel. What despised characteristics of itinerant philosophers did not characterize the ministry of Paul, Silas, and Timothy?
They was greedy and self-seeking, and then they sought glory from men. They was men pleasers.
All right, all right. Greed, self-seeking, all of those things were not part of the ministry of Paul and Silas and Timothy. What privilege did Paul give up to serve the Thessalonian church, and how does he describe his behavior?
He gave of himself. He worked night and day to get the message, the gospel through. And as you stated already, he already had a trade. And as you talked about how that should incorporate in our spiritual life as well. And that he just wanted to do the best he could and not just be a burden to the people.
All
And that
right.
he loved the people that well.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. It's exciting to hear how you all have studied. Outstanding. Let me call this the privilege of financial support. The churches in Macedonia, which the area that Thessalonica, Philippi, Berea are in, were not able to support Paul. And so he and his companions supported themselves. Question 7. What two pictures of parenthood colored Paul's ministry to the Thessalonians? Two pictures.
That of a mother who is gentle, caring, loving, and kind, and self-sacrificing. And that of a father who serves as a protector and preparer of his children for life's upcoming events.
All right. There are some pseudo fake theologians that will try to make you think that Paul had an issue with women and with womanhood. But if he did, he wouldn't have compared himself to a nursing mother. And so that caring relationship that he has, and that's important for all of us that serve in ministry. We need both sides. We need that side that is nurturing and caring, but we also need that side that is protective, that prepares, and that prompts us to move toward the future. All right. Question 7. What did Paul, Silas, and Timothy share? And we talked about this a little bit with the church at Thessalonica that might seem strange in our culture today. And why might it seem strange today?
Well, we talked about the fact that they were willing to share their lives, to invite people in, to let people get close to them. And today we don't do that. But the desire of popularity is strong in our culture today, in the receiving of so many likes on social media, tends to pump up people's ego, and they get to thinking that they are somebody and they're doing something great.
Yeah. Because what we do now is cultivate an image rather than cultivate relationships. One of the pastors that has had a deep and profound impact on my own personal life is Pastor Billy Bell. Pastor Bell did stuff I never saw anybody do. Number one, he was sacrificial. He is sacrificial. When I was in seminary, he bought me a laptop. I was like, you got me a laptop, Doc? A whole laptop. And then when my daughter broke it accidentally, he replaced it. Never charged me for it. Bought shoes. Didn't have any ulterior motive than just trying to help. And he would open his home, and not just to the preachers, but pastor would have barbecues, and they had space, and the people would come to their house and just eat, and we would just hang out, watch movies. And so, there are some people who aren't comfortable with that level of sharing, but others have that genuine gift of hospitality in ministry. And it might seem strange today, but it's important to have those natural, beautiful relationships. And Paul cultivated that, Paul, Silas, and Timothy. In what 3 ways could the Thessalonians bear witness to how Paul had cared for them?
Well, he was devoutly righteous towards God and blameless towards himself. His conscience was clear. And then he was uprightly towards others.
All right. All right. Thanks, Sister Herbert. Thank you. Question 9. How did Paul, Timothy, and Silas encourage the Thessalonian believers to live?
To encourage, comfort, and implore each other to walk worthy of God.
All right. I missed the first part. It cut out for a second. What did you say?
To encourage, comfort, and implore each other to walk worthy of God.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. They encourage the Thessalonian believers to encourage, comfort, and encourage one another to walk worthy of God, to live up to the expectations that God had for them. Lastly, what's the reason the believers are pointed toward the kingdom, and how does that impact us as we serve and wait? Oh, this is one of those personal questions.
I believe it's to solidify their hope in the coming of Christ, and that in turn will, enable them to not be so caught up in what's going on now, but to look
All right.
towards when Christ comes.
All right. All right. Anybody care to share how this impacts you? Sister Hickman is right about what Paul was encouraging the Thessalonian believers to do. How does this impact us? All right.
Well, it impacts me in that it strengthens me every day, and provides hope and encouragement to, make it through. Down through the years, God has been good to me. And so to just keep that in mind, that what he's done before, he can do it again.
Yes.
So, oh Lord, don't get me shouting. Okay.
It's all right. Just don't wreck your laptop. Listen, Clark Sisters had a song that they put out years ago that said, "Is my living in vain?" And the answer to that was no, of course not. Sometimes when we are going through our ministry experiences, how we serve and where we serve, and staying connected to the saints and the church and serving our community, it can be discouraging because of the persecution and the flack that we sometimes catch. But Paul's point is that one day the Lord will show up in glory, call us home with him, and release us from trouble and struggle. And we ought to be motivated by the finish line. The pain of the race does not compare to the joy of crossing the finish line in victory. So I want to encourage us to keep our eyes on the finish line. God bless you. At this time, we'll stop our recording.